Hi everybody, welcome back to PHP Fundamentals. I am your host, Jeffrey Way, and today we're talking about functions, which, as I noted in the last video, the easiest way to think of a function is a reusable bit of code, something that you can imagine using more than once. Well, rather than having to write all of that code manually many times, you can abstract that code away to a function that you reference. That way, if you need to change the inner workings of that code, rather than potentially having to change it in multiple spots within your project, instead, you just change it once within that function. Now, before we get started, I do want to encourage you, if you are a Tuts Plus Premium member, head over to the forums. There's lots of activity. If you have any questions about a specific lesson or a future lesson, this is where you can ask them. We have tutors there to help you, and of course, your fellow classmates would be happy to help you as well. Okay, so let's dig in. So the first thing we need to take a look at is the syntax. And this is something that I've covered a little bit in a previous lesson, but now I want to go over it in more detail. So when you define a function, you can do it like this. You write the keyword function, and now you need to give it a name. And this is how you're going to reference that function, or how you're going to call that function. So in a previous lesson, we created a function called sayHello. So that would be the identifier for the function. And then within parentheses, you have the option of specifying that this function expects some value to be provided from the outside. And this is how your functions can be dynamic and return different data dependent upon the values that you pass to it. So then within curly braces, you execute your code. And generally for a function, you're going to return a value. That's the value that you're going to return to whatever called it. So in our case, we're going to return hi there. And now if I run it, nothing's going to happen. We've just created the function, but we haven't triggered it. So now I'm going to trigger that function. sayHello. Now, when I execute it, wait, you're still not seeing anything. And that's because this function is not echoing anything. We could do that like this, but generally that's considered a bad practice unless you can specify why. And I'll give you an example of why shortly. But in general, try to make your functions short, to the point, and subscribe to the idea that a function is responsible for one thing. So if you have a function that's 50 lines long, that is likely what we refer to as a code smell, meaning there's something wrong with your code because you have 50 lines within this function, and that's probably not going to be reusable. So try to keep your functions short, to the point, and accomplishing one thing. All right, so now we've returned the value. I'm going to echo the result of what was returned from sayHello. And we know we call sayHello, this is returned, so we're essentially saying echo hi there. I run it, and sure enough, we do get hi there. Good. The other option is to store the returned value within a variable, greeting. And now I can echo greeting, of course, and we're going to get the exact same thing. All right, so now we have sayHello. Well, what if we want to say hello to a person? All right, well, we can provide a value. When I call this function, I'm going to pass a name, Joe. So now that I'm passing this value, it needs to be received within our function. So now sayHello needs to accept a value. So we'll call it name. But we can do anything we want. We could say first name. It doesn't matter. You're assigning this variable name. So now we are saying hi there, and we're going to use interpolation to insert the value of $name. So now I'm going to get rid of echo because we don't need it in this case. Now I will echo sayHello, Joe. And now we get hi there, Joe. If we change it to my own name, we get hi there, Jeffrey. So depending upon what we pass, we're going to get something different in response. But now watch what happens if I remove this entirely and we just try to call sayHello without passing a value. Now we're going to get this error or warning. So here it's saying missing argument 1. So now this function expected something. So when you call it and you don't pass a value, it's going to essentially raise its hands up and say, hey, I expected something and you didn't give it to me. I need that value. Well, you can provide default values. And this is very helpful where you want to say, well, if this function is called without any arguments, then we're going to assume a value. So we will set this default value to Buddy. So now we're accepting name, but we're setting a default value of Buddy. So when we call this and I run it, now we're going to get hi there, Buddy. And I'll make sure I add a period at the end. But what's nice about this is any value that you pass will override Buddy. So this is the default value, but as soon as you pass Joe, now it's going to be name equals Joe. And if I run it, you can see that. So in the conditions when you want to provide a value, but you want to set a default as well, this is the way that you would do it. So let's take a look at more of a real world example. So one thing that we've learned is that when we have an array, and let's create one right now, array, and we'll say name is Joe, age is 40, and finally we'll do occupation, and we'll say teacher. All right, so now we have this guy, Joe, his age is 40, his occupation is teacher. So we know that if we want to display this on the screen within the browser, we can run print r array. And if I run that, we're going to get this nice, easy to read version. And this is one of the nice things about CodeRunner. It does make it a little prettier to look at. However, if you were to view this in the browser, and I'll go ahead and save this right now, within Sites, Sandbox, we'll create a new folder called Functions, and within it, I'll save it as index.php. Okay, now I'm going to view it in the browser. What you'll see here is that doesn't look that great. Now, in this case, it's very easy to read, but you can imagine when you have an array with literally 50 to 100 items, all you're going to get is this big jumble of text, and that can be very difficult to read. So what I've recommended in the past is that you view the source, and this provides you with an easier view. But what if we actually wanted to see that within the browser without having to view the source? Well, the way you would do that is instead you would echo a pre-tag. We're just going to wrap that code within pre-tags. And if you're familiar with HTML, you know that a pre-tag will recognize your code formatting. So now if I reload it, now that's looking a lot better. But the problem is every time I want to do this, I don't want to have to echo a pre-tag, print R, then echo another closing pre-tag. So the way we can solve this is by abstracting it away to a reusable bit of code, or a function. So let's try this out. At the top, this might go in a file called functions.php. This is very common. You'll create a file, call it functions.php, and then whenever you need to include those functions, you would require functions.php, and now you have access to all of those functions. But for now, we're going to keep it all on the same page for convenience. So I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call it pp. And this stands for pretty print. So now within here, this is one of those situations when it's okay for me to echo information. Because it's a helper function, it's not meant to be used in production. It's simply for development when I quickly need to get something on the page, and then I can delete that function. So in these cases, it's okay for me to echo it. So now when we call pp, it needs to accept an array or a value. I'm just going to call it value because I don't know what we're going to be providing it. It could be an object, it could be an array. So now we're going to echo a pre-tag, then we're going to print R that value, and then we're going to close the pre-tags. And that's it. That's our first reusable function. So now, rather than having to do all of this manually, print R array, now I can simply run pp, pass in our array, and now if I run it, it looks good there. And if I view it in the browser, now we're getting that formatting because we specified that. So there's your first reusable function. So let's consider our next example. I'm going to move all of these up, and we're going to comment them out so you can use them with the downloadable source. All right, so the next one we're going to do is we're going to create our own function, array pluck. So I'll give you an example of how this will work. We'll create a variable called people, and this will be equal to an array. And within this array, we're going to have information for each person. So we'll have an array, and the first one will be name. We'll use myself, since we've been using this name age example a lot. 27, and we'll do occupation, web developer. All right, so now we have this self-contained array that has information specifically about me. Well, now I can copy this, and I can do yet another one for somebody else. We'll say Joe. Joe is 50, and Joe is a teacher. Lastly, I'm going to do just one more so we have some information to work with. And now we'll do Jane. Age is 30, and her occupation is in marketing. So now we're going to create a special function that will allow us to pluck information from this array. And this is something you'll hear a lot, pluck. So what I want to do is I want to be able to call this custom function. We haven't created it yet, but I'm going to call it pluck, array pluck. And what I want to do is I want to pluck a value out of it. So I'm going to say name, and then I'm going to provide it the array that I'm working with. Notice how I am figuring out how I want to call the function before I create the function. And this is important. It allows you to think a lot more about how you want to interact with that function. And then you write the logic to make that code work. So now, ideally, when I run array pluck, I want it to go through this array, and I want it to return a new array containing only the values that are associated with the name key. So ideally, what I would want to be returned would be an array with Jeffrey, Joe, and Jane. I'm plucking the name values out of that array. Alternatively, if I did age, then I would expect a new array that contains 27, 50. I'm plucking out the age values. All right, so now that we know how we want it to behave and how we want to call it, now we get to implement that function. And we'll do it right here. Again, this could go in your functions file. So let's get started. Function, array, pluck. And I'm going to show you two different ways that you can write this function. We'll do it more the easy way, and then I'll show you a slightly more advanced way to accomplish it. So first, this function needs to accept the item to pluck, so we'll say to pluck, and then it needs to accept the array, so we'll call that ARR. So the first thing I can think of is I know that I want this function to return this new array that contains the values. So we'll create this new array, and we'll call it new AR. That would be one way. You will also see people call it RET, and this stands for return. So what are we going to return? We're going to set it to an array. We're going to populate that returned array, and then that's going to be returned. And we'll use the old syntax. So now we've created this new array. I'm going to filter through the array that was provided. So the array that was provided is actually going to be 3 items, and each of those items will be an array themselves. So let's say for each array as item. Now, at this point, item will be equal to this on the first iteration, then item will be equal to that one, and then finally, item will be equal to that one, and then it'll break out of the for each. So at this point, all we need to do is take that return array, and we need to fill it up with the value, in this case, of the age key. So we want to say return, we're going to add a new value to it, equals, and you can also use array push, but we'll use this syntax, equals item, and if we were to hard code it in, that's what we would do, item age. So then watch what happens if I print RET and I run it. Notice that we're getting only those age values. If I were to change it to name and I run it, now we're only getting those values. So at this point though, the value that they want to pluck is contained within this variable to pluck. So I'm going to replace this because I don't want to hard code the value into it. I'm going to replace that with the variable. Now if I run it again, now we have age. But if we scroll down and we change it to occupation, that's what I want to pluck out, and I run it, now we've grabbed those values. So the final step is we don't want to print R, we simply want to return that. And at this point, array pluck is going to pluck those values out. We can print R this or store it within a variable. We will just use a terrible variable name called plucked, and then if I print R plucked, we have successfully created our array pluck function. And that was really very easy. So this is one way we can do it. I'm going to show you a slightly different way that you can do it as well, using array map. Now, array map is a built-in PHP function that we haven't yet reviewed, but now's the perfect time. So I'm going to copy this and comment it out, and now we're going to create our second version of this, and I will simply remove everything within it. This time, we're going to return array map. We're going to call a PHP function. So this function will accept a couple parameters. The first parameter is going to be the function to execute, and the second parameter is going to be the array that you're working with. Well, we call that ARR. So now when we call our array pluck function, it's going to call this array map. And what that's going to do is it's going to execute this function for every item within this array. So now we can call that item. And for now, let's simply print our item to see what's going on here. I'm going to run it, and notice if I scroll to the top, okay, it printed out that array, then that array, then that array. Okay, so now we know the same thing here. Item is going to be equal to this one, then on the next loop, that one, and then on the final iteration, it'll equal the last item within the array. So now the difference here with array map is we're going to return the value that will be assigned. Now in this case, with array map, whatever we return will be assigned. So I'll give you an example. Return, and we'll write my name here. Now if I run it, we'll get Jeff. So whatever we return, and if it makes it easier, let's create a variable called RET. Then I'm going to print RET, and I will comment this version out for now. All right, so now we're getting that same thing. So think about it. Array map filters through this array. For each one, we write some code within our function to specify what is returned. So for example, we could say item name equals changed, and then we'll return item. And now if I run that and we scroll to the top, now we've updated the name value. So array map simply gives us a function that we can execute each time, which gives us the ability to manipulate the array however we want. Now in our case, all we want to do though is we just want to pluck the value out. So I'm going to return item to pluck just as we did before, but now we're going to have this error that I guarantee you'll encounter a lot, and it confused me quite a bit at first. If I run it, we get this undefined variable to pluck. And this is your first introduction to variable scope. So here's the problem. Notice that we're trying to use this variable right here, and that's where the error is. And it's saying, I have no idea what toPluck is. And we can ensure that if I try to echo toPluck, and then I'm going to run this die command. And what die means is it just completely stops the PHP execution. And so this is helpful when you want to see a value and you don't want to do anything else on the page. You immediately want to stop. It's good for development. Now if I run it, we're still going to get this problem, undefined variable toPluck. So why is that? Well, we know up here we have toPluck. Let's try it. Scroll to the top, and I'm going to have to comment that out for the time being. There we go, and we can see the item toPluck is occupation. So how can that be where right here we know what toPluck is, but the next couple lines, it doesn't know what toPluck is? And this is what variable and local scope means. So I'm going to have an entire lesson dedicated to scope because it's really important, and the way PHP implements it is very different than the way lots of C languages do. So the basic idea though is every function, here's a function, and then we also have another anonymous function right here. Every function has its own local scope. So in this case, this toPluck variable, that is available in this local scope. But now when we try to use it within this anonymous function, well, this anonymous function has its own local scope. So when you reference toPluck within here, PHP is going to assume that you're referencing a local variable that is within the scope of this function. But as we know, that variable doesn't exist. We haven't created it. It's not leaving its scope and moving up the chain looking for another variable with that name. It's simply referring to the local version of that variable, which doesn't exist. So there's a couple different ways that we can do it. You can create a global variable. In this case, though, we're going to use something new within PHP 5.3. And it's essentially the way that PHP implements another scary word, closures. Don't let this confuse you. We're going to cover all of it. For now, just come along. We're going to use toPluck. And for now, I just want you to think of it this way. We're calling this anonymous function. We know it has its own local scope. So we want to be able to say, I want you to call this function, and I want to give you this variable. I want you to use this variable within your function. So we're giving it toPluck. So now within this anonymous function, it does have access to toPluck because we gave it to it. And that's the most you need to think of it for now until we cover scope in much greater detail. All right, so now I can uncomment this, and if we run it again, now we're getting it. Good. But this time, rather than assigning the result of array map, I don't really need to do that, because notice we assign it to a variable, and then we could return ret, and if we print art at the bottom, yeah, that works, but there's really no reason to. Let's just remove that. We're going to refactor our code. Refactor means you're going to take the code, you're going to change it to make it more optimized or shorter or more elegant, but you're not actually changing the effect. You're not changing the way it functions. There we go. We just removed 2 or 3 lines. We've refactored our code, but we still get the exact same output. So now we can say, I want to pluck out the name, and we're going to store that within a variable called names. And then we will loop through names, and we will echo out the name value. And now we have Jeffrey, Joe, Jane. Okay, so congratulations. You've created 2 functions today. First, we created our simple helper function, pp, for pretty print. And then I showed you 2 different ways that you could implement your own custom array pluck function. Now, if you're at the point right now where you think, well, I'm not really sure when I would use array pluck, trust me, there are many times when this will come in handy, and that's why very popular libraries, everything from Underscore, which is a JavaScript library, to lots of different frameworks offer their own form of a pluck helper function. So the core idea that I want you to take from this lesson is a function is reusable code. If you ever imagine using code more than once in your project, connecting to a database, querying rows from a database, all of that is reusable stuff. You need to abstract that away to its own function. And then at first, you'll store these functions within a functions.php file, at least at first, and then you'll learn more elegant ways to store your code. But for now, that'll work great. All right, my name is Jeffrey Way, and I'll see you in the next lesson.